It's been really, really interesting thinking through my presentation whilst I've been listening to the others, and I've got 3 or 4 keywords that I've jotted down. Early on, we talked about the stigma of food, and I hope that something about that will come through in talking about the Scottish food policy. The other side of stigma is obviously dignity, and that's a really important concept as well when we're talking about food security, food insecurity. The holistic approach, a couple of people have mentioned that as well, and Michael sort of saying that in his presentation about contextualizing food security and security. And I think those are the sorts of concepts that I can hang what I'm going to tell you about the Scottish food policy. So I'm not going to talk so much about hunger or the solutions of the kind that we've heard about already, but I'm going to talk about policy. So it is going to be a little drier than Michael's presentation, I'm sorry. But I'm going to talk about community and political action on food, and about Scotland's national food policy, food and drink policy, called Recipe for Success. And I think that's exactly what it is. It's a recipe. It's not a finished dish. But I believe that it shows how a simple, a visionary, consultative and cross-cutting policy can lay down very deep foundations for effective action and change. And I think there are many, many lessons that can be learned from the Scottish food policy, but I'll only have time to give you the very briefest sketch of the policy as a whole. Then what I propose to do is to focus on some Scottish policy initiatives, not necessarily all in the National Food Plan, on children's health and well-being that have helped shape the National Food Policy, in order to demonstrate how a whole of system or a holistic approach towards food is the only way for us realistically to have a food secure future that's equitable and sustainable. And I think that's what we're all aiming for. And I'll illustrate my argument with a brief look at a school meals programme which involves public procurement, and it takes place in Ayrshire, which is just south of Glasgow in the west of Scotland. So why Scotland? Why am I here talking about Scotland tonight? We're 12,000 miles away. As most of you will know, the federal government has recently issued a green paper on the National Food Plan, and like a big Australia, it's a very big plan. It weighs in at an obese 279 pages, compared with Scotland's neat and trim 40 pages. And the point that I'm making is that it is possible to have a national food plan that is concise yet comprehensive, and that people will read and easily digest. Another similarity is that the principal drivers behind the two nations' food policies are very similar. Amongst them are the desire for an economically robust food industry, a desire to ensure food security from the national scale right down to the household, a rising sense of concern about food production and climate change, and a greater sense of urgency about the spiralling cost of diet-related diseases. And we've mentioned diabetes, obesity, and heart disease. Now, anytime you say Scotland and diet in the same sentence, some wag's going to say, aye, a deep-fried Mars bar. And it's true. It's true. Scotland has a truly, truly terrible nutrition profile, especially amongst children. It has one of the worst diet-related health records in the developed world, while paradoxically producing some of Europe's finest food and drink. Just think smoked salmon and single malt whiskey. 1 in 4 children in Scotland are officially recognised as living in poverty. That's below the poverty line, and that can frequently, but by no means always, mean poor nutrition. And this is one of the reasons why the Scottish Government invests so heavily on food in schools. And also at the same time, Scotland relies heavily on the food industry for employment. 1 in 5 jobs in Scotland is linked to the food and drink industry. We've got to remember whiskey and beer. So already we can start to join the dots between the production end of the food system and the consumer end. And I argue that the joined up Scottish food policy makes these links and many others in a simple 5-point framework that covers the food system from paddock to plate. If any of you picked up the little sheet outside, which is the front page of the Scottish Food Policy, it's on the bottom of every page. It just runs like a thread all the way through. So the main features of the framework is a healthier Scotland through better access to affordable, safe, healthy and fresh seasonal food. A wealthier and fairer Scotland through sustainable economic growth in the food industry, which means jobs and exports. A smarter Scotland, they say, with a better skilled and innovative food industry, so more competitive, running more efficiently. Also, on the other end of the spectrum, a population that's better informed about food and nutrition and their food choices. Safer and stronger, which I think slightly surprised me. And what they mean by that is by doing some of the aforementioned things that they'll ensure a more resilient food system in international competition, guaranteeing food security by having more food produced in Scotland for Scottish consumption. But critically, all of that adds up to keeping jobs locally, which strengthen communities. And greener as well. Scotland, like New Zealand, I suspect, and Ireland certainly, have a reputation of this clean and green, which with increasingly choosy consumers does actually count for something. And also it brings into play the notions of responsible stewardship of the land and waste policy, which is very pertinent to what we've heard already this evening. So it's important to take stock that Scotland's food policy wasn't developed in isolation. There were many previous government initiatives and non-government initiatives and interventions that helped inform and shape all of it, including the section on health and especially children's health. So this is just a very brief timeline to give you a sort of notion of how this policy that I'm talking about might have come about. In '96, there was a Scottish Diet Action Plan, which was basically a big gun approach to try and improve the health of Scottish people over a 10-year time frame. But the implementation was voluntary, and its impact on the national diet was found when it was reviewed in 2007 not to have been very significant at all. So it was a voluntary plan, boom, so what? What was significant through that plan was there was a substantial rise in the rate of breastfeeding, which was fantastic, a bigger uptake of school meals, and fresh fruit. Fresh fruit was getting into schools as well. This was part of the government piling money at that. So in 2002, the government launched a programme called Hungry for Success, which was a whole of school policy on school meals provisions. And what it did was it established mandatory guidelines for local authorities who are responsible for providing school meals, whether they're free or not, as to what could and couldn't be served in school canteens. So chips and deep fried Mars bars were out, fresh water, fresh fruit, salads, all those sorts of dishes were in. And then the difference, say, between Scotland and what's happened here is that the Scottish government then took the bull by the horns and it enshrined that mandate in 2007 in legislation. And part of that legislation also gave local authorities the power, i.e. more or less said, do it, was to provide free school meals. The aim is to provide free school meals to all school children in years 1 to 3. And also what kind of meals that they could be provided with as well. And running in parallel with this school meals programme was another semi-government funded programme run by the Soil Association called Food for Life. And what that did in parallel with the kind of better school meals going into schools was to weave food into the whole school curriculum by informing children about where food came from, that milk comes from cows and carrots are pulled out of the ground, and also to inform them about farmers, food production, healthy stewardship of the land. So it was kind of a holistic program. So again, we're seeing a whole system thing happening from farm to fork. So there was a lot happening around the late noughties in Scotland, including a government-sponsored pilot programme in 5 local authority areas, which offered free school meals to a total of 35,000 school children to evaluate the expected improvements in health, nutrition and behaviour. And the intention was that if that pilot proved successful, they'd roll it out throughout Scotland. The results did show a higher uptake of school meals in the schools that got it, a greater willingness by children to try different kinds of foods they'd never experienced before. And they found that children were discussing food at home more with their parents from the experiences they'd had at school, and there was some shift happening there. Nonetheless, the trials were absolutely realistic that this wasn't going to be a quick fix. It was a short trial. It was too short to change behaviour amongst children. And also that these pilot programmes didn't show any change in the quality, the quantity of school being provided, of meals being provided, in the food being provided in the free school meals. However, step back a little bit, and one of the local authorities in this pilot project a few years previously had gone and done a solo run. And they knew they were going to be involved they tended to be involved in this programme, but they thought, we'll do it with a wee twist. And what if we also tried to do it all through local procurement? And it was largely down to the innovation of one person who just had this brainwave and set about doing it. And that produced some really interesting results, which to my mind undoubtedly fed in to this later food policy process in 2008. And it's interesting because public procurement is another central plank of the full Scottish food strategy. So basically what this lot did in Ayrshire is they took 11 schools and they set about procuring all the food locally, which again feeds into this 5-point framework. But again, it was a short pilot project, but it again was evaluated on a basis of looking at the social return on investment of this pilot project. And it concluded that every £1 spent on this local procurement provision of school meals created 6 quid's worth of economic and social environmental benefits. That's a bit like the example you gave of the Foodbank of, $1 donation having a retail value of $7. So the scaling up of the value of what you do was shown in this. And it also meant that for every extra, 13 pence, which is nothing, that spent per school meal, that added up to £500,000 extra money coming back into the local community in 1 year. And Ayrshire is a really small area. So fast forward to 2011, and now more than 90% of the food used in school meals in Ayrshire is local, it's fresh, it's unprocessed, and 30% of it's organic. The uptake of school meals has substantially increased, whether you're getting them free through benefits or whether you're paying for them. And that's contrary, the national trend is going down. There's also been an effect in reducing the carbon footprint of every school to the equivalent of taking 10 cars off the road per annum, 10 Australian cars that do a lot more mileage. So these are all fantastic and enviable achievements. And I think they're well summed up by one headmaster of one of these schools who said, and I quote, he said, "We're quite a deprived area. So if we can put anything back into the local area and local community, then it helps the local businesses, local people, the children and us. It is environmentally better and more healthy for children." So just to conclude, the Scottish food policy is not a finished dish, it's a recipe. It acknowledges the enormous complexity of the food systems, yet it manages to accommodate those complexities in a simple but comprehensive framework. And this allows work to begin. And most of all, it shows us in Anti-Poverty Week what a difference government and non-government intervention can make in children's lives. Thank you.